Okay, I'm taking some material from this book called Building a Resilient Tomorrow. I should title the podcast appropriately. And it's a long book, has a lot of details on various aspects of adaptation and building a resilient tomorrow that are not considered in other books we have looked at in terms of how we need the law and the lawyers as well. But I'm going to skip all that and just come to their section on the decision making tools for uh, politicians and governments and investors and so on, so that we get straight to the prescriptions. They call it prescriptions and provocations, and each one is related to a sector that I won't even show you the title, because the bullet points make sense in terms of what they are talking about. So starting with this one, the federal government, and by the way, this is entirely focused on the US, but these points are applicable to all countries across the globe, so I'm going to read them just to use the US context to get some point for the rest of the world. The federal government and states should direct meaningful portions of the revenues from cap and trade systems and carbon taxes to investments in resilience. Green banks should also adopt resilience as a core part of their mission. This is applicable for all, of course. Green bond standard setting organizations should develop definitions and standards to govern the acceptable use of proceeds from the sale of resilience bonds and actively publicize new offerings of resilience bonds. Okay, some specific recommendations there. State and local governments and private sector should pilot value capture methodologies to finance resilient infrastructure. We have discussed this a little bit before in terms of doing the cost-benefit analysis, the net present values, how the benefits are delayed, so often accounting for returns on investments is not easy, and how normative values have to be included in terms of protecting the most vulnerable, value for all, equity, justice, and so on when we do adaptation. State governments should pursue forming risk pools to purchase parametric insurance products or issuing cat bonds to access cash quickly in the aftermath of disasters. We've discussed some aspects of this, including how cash payments are sometimes the most efficient way to help people recover and rebuild. The federal government should continue to protect the NFIP through the use of reinsuring and or cat bonds. Okay, I got a message here. Let me pause for a second and come back. Okay, sorry about that. I have to take care of these things because some of them are urgent and have to be addressed, even if I have to stop the podcast and restart. So state governments should pursue forming risk pools to purchase parametric insurance products or issuing cat bonds to access cash quickly in the aftermath of disasters. The federal program should continue to protect the National Flood Insurance Program through the use of reinsurance and or cat bonds. There are other details in terms of how you protect against floods. For example, planning not to allow people to settle in floodplains and so on, which we will not get into here. Prescriptions and provocations, in this case looking at data. The federal government should rethink the organization of the US climate data system, which applies for all countries, drawing on lessons from other countries to ensure that climate and weather data from across the government remains free, openly sourced, and disseminated in user-friendly ways. This is very critical for the global south, where data is often not collected and not shared or served properly or in time. Cities and states should consider creating data centers that collect and analyze local demographic and environmental data that are useful for resilience planning, especially when you want to compute vulnerabilities and risk maps. These data on demographics and socioeconomics and environment become very essential and critical, and often they are not available in a timely manner, or often they are not connected in a granular enough fashion. Insurers and reinsurers should invest in catastrophe models that better reflect future climate risk and work with the regulators to ensure that insurance premiums reflect that risk. We've addressed some of these in terms of how the banking systems and insurers, reinsurers have to worry about properly accounting for their exposures in terms of investments or payouts or insured assets. And also governments have to do stress tests to make sure that the financial system is capable of handling risks despite all the uncertainties. The federal government, in partnership with the private and non-profit sectors, should expand the availability of open source free catastrophe models. The federal government, in partnership with the private sector, should create a cadre of climate science translators to help decision makers in state and local governments to evaluate climate risks, develop resilience strategies, and access federal funding. I've talked about these elsewhere on how the Network for Greening the Finance System and the US Federal Federal Reserves has set up protocols for translating physical risks from climate change, acute and chronic, to various sectors like banking and insurance, region specific, and this needs to happen everywhere in the context of data that's needed to do these properly as well. So monitoring, evaluation, and reporting is always critical for risks and how they are being hedged against. Prescriptions and provocations in the case of social issues. Governments should apply behavioral science insights to relevant policies, programs, and operations where such insights are likely advance significantly climate resilience. So policies, programs, and operations are need strategizing, identifying the goals, and then the strategies need to be evolved to design policies and the optimal programs and implementing operations with room in the budgets and so on. Large companies should integrate regular climate risk scenario analysis into key planning processes, including assessments of climate impacts on their supply chains and continuity of business operations. The federal government should support a research program to road test the effectiveness of different types of communications and warnings regarding climate and weather-related threats. Communication, especially of the uncertainties and when it comes to future risks, what are the kind of scenarios being picked for policies and decisions and investments, etc., should be made clear. A climate nudge unit should be established at the federal level with a clear mandate and resources to study, design, pilot, and evaluate behavioral science initiatives that promote climate resilience. So the last mile issues are always about co-developing these solutions for resilience so that people are aware of what they are getting into and what is expected or required out of them in terms of agency, their willingness and ability to do things that are helping the resilience of their own individual future, as well as communities and firms and their dependence on infrastructure, public services, and so on. Prescriptions and provocations. Governments should invest in enhanced disease, so this is for health, disease surveillance, predictive capabilities, and early warning systems to facilitate preparedness efforts and preventive action. I have a full course on climate and health and sub-seasonal to seasonal predictions for health and other things that you can follow up with. Hospitals and other medical care facilities should conduct climate vulnerability assessments and invest in resilience enhancing retrofits and upgrades so that they can continue to provide care during extreme climate related events. Whether it's hurricanes or, in fact, these should also work when there are pandemics that hit, because they can confound with heat waves, floods, droughts, and other climate-related events as well. Medical, nursing, and public health schools should promptly incorporate relevant climate change-related material into their core curricula. And right now I'm working on curriculum development for a degree in India, and the kind of opposition you get, the kind of niggling the details that people get bogged down in, miss the point about the risks we are facing and how quickly we have to adjust our agenda in terms of even education and training. Community leaders, in partnership with academic institutions, emergency managers, and other stakeholders, should develop and implement heat action plans to prepare for extreme heat events in at-risk areas. So that needs mapping at-risk areas, vulnerabilities, because even within at-risk areas, even at a city level, neighborhoods will have different vulnerabilities based on socioeconomic levels and other issues like education, etc., per capita income, etc. Finally, government should bolster traditional social safety nets as well as temporary safety net measures that can be deployed in the aftermath of extreme events. Federal and state governments should work with the reinsurance industry to pair social protection programs with parametric insurance policies. So insurance policies are often creating a moral hazard in terms of people exposing themselves to more risks because they feel confident with the insurance. But reinsurance companies have to watch out for these kind of follies to make sure that insurance companies are not exposing themselves to undue risks and exposing people or promoting undue risk taking by people and firms. Mayors with federal support should regularly convene local private sector leaders and other stakeholders to identify climate risks and develop collaborative plans to protect supply chains, workers, and critical infrastructure. That's very critical. Governments and the private sector should work together to develop innovative solutions to locate isolated and vulnerable persons and ensure they have access to life-saving information and resources. In the US, it's very common for people to go deep into the woods or isolated mountain locations and so on and live on their own as long as they have water and electricity, but they may be increasingly becoming isolated and vulnerable, and they need to be built into the system in terms of their protection and access to life-saving information and resources. As an adaptation strategy, it may become impossible to protect people that are really out there, but that's a normative question as to whether you will let people do whatever they want and then protect them at any cost, or you expect people to move when they are exposed to risks that are too expensive to protect against. Federal government agencies that provide international development assistance should expand efforts to help other countries in building climate resilience, especially with respect to food and water security, public health, gender equity, and disaster risk management. Governments should experiment with methodologies to help ensure that investments in resilience are made based on considerations of welfare impacts, not just economic losses. So that's where we get into non-market goods and normative questions as to what society's preferences are in terms of protecting its people, its citizens, and how they pay for it, etc. Sorry, that was not the last one. Federal governments should develop a national strategy to provide coordinated government services for transit and resettlement of displaced persons, which includes mechanisms to transfer health insurance, job training and placement assistance, cross-jurisdiction recognition of professional licenses, tax relief to cover relocation-related expenses, and seamless access to financial services. This is assuming people are willing to move. So convincing people to move or finding regulations to make them move based on the risk information, risk maps, vulnerability maps, especially when it's future risks. If you go to North Carolina and ask builders to retreat from the coastline, they are not going to be very eager to take this kind of advice. So what are the levers that can be used to incentivize them to move? So these are a few of the ideas. The federal government should plan for the creation of a National Relocation Commission to oversee policy development for relocation, coordinate relevant agency activities, and implement national strategy. It's clear that relocating is one of the key adaptation strategies, but how to actually make it happen in the context of each state and their cultural norms and expectations is anything but trivial. Governments, in partnership with academic institutions and other stakeholders, should identify potential receiver communities and develop plans to finance and make strategic investments in infrastructure and social services in those communities. So this is still about displacing people or relocating, as we call it. The federal government should provide incentives to communities to establish no-build zones to preclude development in areas facing high risk of climate impacts. As I mentioned, how people and developers and communities perceive risk and what they want to do about it in terms of creating no-build zones is very region dependent in the US, because California will behave very differently than Texas, which will behave very differently than New York, and so on and so forth. The international community should reach agreement on the status of permanently displaced persons whose state of origin is uninhabitable and severely threatened by climate change. So we're talking about offering climate asylum, for example, to people from highly vulnerable countries that become non-productive in terms of agriculture or floods or droughts or whatever else. But this is a very tricky issue in terms of reaching international accords. Business leaders should consider ways to scale up operations in areas likely to receive persons displaced by climate change and to assist their own workers in making a successful transition. These are kind of learning by doing adaptive management strategies, where business leaders have to look forward, assess risks, and do things now, which comes down to cost-benefit analysis and net present value of the investments and how we discount the future, and whether we are worrying about profits still and expecting that profits are protected when we invest in the future resilience, or we are just doing it as a social cause, or we are not paying attention to them or avoiding investing in things by using a very high discount rate, saying it's not worth it, and so on. So these are tricky things. The federal government should establish a system that provides national security policymakers with intelligence and risk assessments that are informed by the best available climate science. So climate change impacts are now, and climate displacements are now, national security issues, not only for the US but even for countries like India, which are surrounded by highly climate vulnerable entities and with very high distrust among across borders. And climate vulnerability is connected across the borders. Climate change doesn't care about international boundaries, right? So we have to worry about all these things, about how a vulnerability of a neighbor becomes your national security issue. Federal agencies should develop strategies to address climate-related risks in national security hotspots and other areas of strategic importance, including economic impacts, food and water insecurity, increased migrant flows, and public health threats. So what happens far away may become your problem, especially if they are your trading partners or source of resources for critical minerals and elements for building your, reliance on electric vehicles or other things, and so on. The Department of Defense and other relevant agencies should invest in measures to protect military assets to ensure readiness in the face of climate change, as well as screen all proposed military acquisitions for climate resilience. Defense contractors should identify and address climate-related risks to their supply chains and operations to avoid disruptions in military procurement. Actually, militaries are well ahead of governments, because as Congress and Senate, Congress includes Senate and Congress, they are always struggling with lobbyists and others to decide whether climate action, Paris Agreement are good things for the US or not, while military keeps moving forward based on their own evaluation of risks, because if they're building a new port or their assets are in a country which is highly vulnerable to climate impacts, they cannot wait for the politicians to make decisions. They keep making their own decisions, evaluating their own risks, and so on. So that's a good thing, but hopefully the policymakers pay attention to all those things as well. Okay.